Emily had always been drawn to quiet places and simple things. After a tough childhood bouncing between foster homes, she craved stability more than anything. At 23, she moved to a small town in Vermont, hoping for a fresh start. The air was crisp, the people were kind, and the world felt calm for once. It was during her 3rd month in town, while working part-time at a vintage bookstore, that she met Adrian. He walked in just before closing one evening, tall and graceful, with an air of timeless elegance. His voice was smooth, low, and carried an accent she couldn't place. He asked for an obscure book on ancient mythology, something only a handful of people might ever request. Emily didn't have it in stock, but she promised to order it. Adrian smiled and said he would return in a few days. There was something hypnotic about him, the way he held eye contact just a little longer than normal, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Still, she found herself intrigued. Adrian returned 3 days later, just as he said he would. Over time, his visits became more frequent, lingering longer each time. They talked about books, life, their pasts, though Adrian was always vague about his. He said he was from nowhere in particular, had traveled a lot, never stayed in one place too long. He had no social media, no family photos, no references to childhood memories. When Emily pressed, he'd simply say, "Some stories are better left untold," with a wink that made her blush and forget the question altogether. After only 6 months of dating, Adrian proposed. It seemed fast, too fast, but Adrian made her feel seen, cherished. For a girl who had grown up never knowing who to trust, his unwavering presence felt like safety. He bought a house deep in the woods outside town, a beautifully restored colonial with creaky floors, ivy-covered walls, and a fireplace in every room. Emily was enchanted by it. They married privately on a rainy afternoon, with just a local justice of the peace and 2 strangers as witnesses. It was strange, but romantic in its own way. People in town asked questions, of course. Where's he from? What does he do? Why doesn't he come into town more often? But Emily brushed it all off. Adrian was a private man, she said. He worked from home, did freelance consulting, something involving rare languages and old texts. She didn't really understand it, but she trusted him. He had brought light into her lonely life, and she wasn't about to let rumors ruin that. The first year of marriage was almost perfect. Adrian was attentive, affectionate, even playful. He cooked, read aloud to her, filled the house with music and warmth. But even then, there were little things Emily noticed but never dared to voice. He never ate in front of her. He never slept through the night, always wandering the house after midnight. He kept one room locked at all times, telling her it was just for storage, full of boring work stuff she wouldn't care about. Once, when she peeked under the door, she saw a faint red light flickering from within, like candlelight, but colder, darker. Still, she told herself these were harmless quirks. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had pasts they didn't want to share. Adrian loved her, she told herself. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper. He brought her flowers for no reason and whispered strange, poetic words into her ears at night. Sometimes those words echoed in her dreams, even though she couldn't remember what they meant. Sometimes she woke up with her heart racing, soaked in sweat, convinced someone had been standing at the foot of the bed, only to find Adrian watching her quietly, saying he'd been there the whole time. As the years went by, Emily's world became smaller. The once charming house in the woods, where she thought she'd found peace, began to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary. She rarely left anymore. What started as a conscious choice to focus on home and her marriage slowly turned into an unspoken rule. Adrian never told her not to go out, but his eyes always dimmed a little when she mentioned visiting town. His subtle disapproval hung heavy in the air, enough to make her cancel plans before they ever began. The isolation grew so naturally, she hardly noticed it until it was already complete. In their 2nd year of marriage, Emily realized something peculiar. Adrian never changed, not just emotionally, but physically. He looked exactly the same as the day they'd met. The same sharp jawline, flawless skin, not a single grey hair or wrinkle. She laughed about it once, playfully accusing him of hiding a portrait of himself. In the attic like Dorian Gray, he had only smiled, not amused, not offended, just still. There was something deeply unsettling about how he could hold a smile without blinking, how his gaze didn't wander like most people's did during casual conversation. By their 5th year, Emily had stopped bringing it up. There were other things that concerned her more. Adrian was never around during the day. He told her he worked in a private study in the basement, locked away to avoid distractions. She wasn't allowed in. If she ever knocked, he wouldn't answer. The door was always locked, and sometimes, late in the evening, she'd hear murmuring. Voices from beneath the floor, deep, rhythmic chants in a language that twisted and curled in her ears like smoke. When she asked him about it, he'd laugh gently and say it was just an audiobook he was narrating for work, something in Latin or Sumerian, nothing important. But the excuses started to wear thin. Some nights, Emily would wake up alone, Adrian, nowhere to be found. She'd walk through the cold, dark halls of the house calling his name, only to find him hours later sitting on the back porch, staring into the trees. He wouldn't turn to look at her when she approached. He'd just sit, there, unmoving, as if listening to something only he could hear. When she asked him what he was doing, he'd respond with vague remarks about nature, silence, or listening to the old world. Emily's dreams had begun to change too. They were no longer just dreams, but vivid, pulsing nightmares. She saw twisted figures crawling across the ceilings, black eyes peering from the corners, and voices whispering her name from inside the walls. When she woke, Adrian would be beside her, wide awake, watching her closely. His eyes were always open in the dark. He never seemed to sleep. Once, in a half-asleep daze, she whispered to him, "Do you ever rest?" He answered without hesitation, "Not in the way you do." There were moments she considered leaving, but the idea always faded. It wasn't just fear. It was like something in the house itself drained her will. The longer she stayed, the more exhausted she felt. Her reflection in the mirror grew paler with each passing month. Her body felt heavier, her thoughts slower. It was as if the house, or Adrian, or something unseen, was feeding off her spirit in small, invisible pieces. She tried to call her sister once, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The phone line was dead. Every time she picked it up, there was no dial tone, just a low static hum that sometimes crackled with distant whispers. She even tried writing letters, but the mail never arrived, and when she asked Adrian, he claimed he'd dropped them off. The mailbox outside the house remained untouched, no matter the season, no matter how long it had been since anything had been delivered. The world outside was slipping away. It started with the scratching, soft, almost rhythmic, like tiny fingers dragging across the wooden beams inside the walls. At first, Emily thought it might be mice or squirrels. The house was old after all, and nestled deep in the woods where wildlife was bound to wander close. But it wasn't just in one spot. The sounds followed her, from the bedroom to the living room to the hallway at night. Wherever she went, it seemed to travel just beneath the surface, as though something unseen was tracing her every step. She mentioned it to Adrian once over dinner, her voice hesitant, almost embarrassed. He looked at her for a long moment and said nothing. Then, with a half smile, he told her not to worry, that old houses creaked and groaned, that the wind often made strange sounds, but there was no wind those nights, and the scratching came like clockwork at exactly 3 a.m., as if whatever caused it was waiting for a specific moment to begin its haunting routine. Emily began staying awake late into the night, sitting in silence, staring at the walls, waiting. And without fail, at the stroke of 3 the noise would start, first faint and scattered, then louder, more insistent. One night, it was so intense she could feel vibrations in the floorboards beneath her feet. When she pressed her ear to the wall, she didn't hear rodents or movement. She heard breathing, deep, slow, inhuman breathing. It wasn't long before the symbols began to appear. At first, they were small, almost unnoticeable. A strange curve etched into the underside of a window frame, a tiny triangle hidden beneath the rug. She might have dismissed them if not for the one she found under the bed. It was drawn in a dark red substance that flaked like dried blood and formed a circle filled with jagged lines and unfamiliar letters. She tried to clean it, scrubbing until her fingers ached, but the marks wouldn't fade. They looked burned into the wood, as though seared by fire. Adrian never acknowledged them. When she showed him the one under the bed, he glanced at it only, briefly before saying it was just an old stain, probably something left behind by the previous owners. Emily wanted to believe him, but the symbols began to multiply. In the corners of closets, behind curtains, even on the ceiling above her pillow, always hidden, always just subtle enough to question her sanity. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night to find new ones drawn on the window glass, as if traced by a wet fingertip, disappearing before she could show anyone. The air in the house began to feel heavier. During the day, it was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears like pressure underwater. At night, the silence was broken only by the scratching, the breathing, and now, the whispers. They came from all directions, barely audible, just under the threshold of understanding, like someone murmuring through a wall or just behind a closed door. They never spoke full words, only fragments. Sometimes her name, sometimes sounds that didn't belong to any language she recognized. Emily started writing them down in a notebook, hoping to find a pattern, a clue, anything. But the letters shifted, changed, as if they were alive. What she wrote at night looked different in the morning. One time the pages were blank, despite being filled just hours before. Another time, she found symbols she didn't remember drawing etched into the margins, almost identical to the ones burned into the wood throughout the house. The worst part wasn't the scratching or the symbols, it was Adrian's indifference. No matter what she showed him, no matter how frightened she became, he remained calm, unreadable. He never raised his voice, never questioned her sanity, but he never comforted her either. He would only say, again and again, "You're safe here, Emily," in that same flat tone, like a phrase memorized long ago and repeated out of obligation rather than care. By the time Emily reached her breaking point, she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked hollow, skin pale and drawn, eyes sunken, lips always dry no matter how much water she drank. The house had drained. Her and Adrian had become a stranger who watched her more than he touched her. Her world had narrowed to a routine of silence, shadows, and sounds that didn't belong in the realm of the living. She needed answers. One cold morning in late October, she bundled up and walked into town. It had been months since she'd left the house, and even the sunlight felt unfamiliar. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe a friendly face, maybe someone who could explain what was happening. She wandered into the local church, mostly out of instinct. It was old and modest, with creaky pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light onto the wooden floor. The air smelled of wax and dust. The priest was an elderly man named Father Thomas. His eyes were kind but sharp, as if they saw more than he let on. Emily didn't intend to open up to him, but the moment she sat across from him in his quiet office, the words tumbled out. She spoke of the strange symbols, the whispers, the locked room, Adrian's refusal to answer questions. She told him about the red circle under the bed, the static on the phone, and the way time seemed to dissolve inside her home. She left out nothing. Father Thomas didn't interrupt. He listened patiently, his fingers laced together, his gaze steady. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he stood, walked to a shelf, and pulled down an old leather-bound book. He flipped through the pages slowly, carefully, until he found what he was looking for. He turned the book toward her and tapped a page with his finger. The illustration was crude but unmistakable. A creature cloaked in shadows, humanoid but not quite human, surrounded by symbols similar to the ones Emily had found in her home. He told her of ancient beings called jinn, entities not of heaven or earth, made of smokeless fire, known across cultures by many names. Some were harmless, some even helpful, but others were darker, bound by rage or desire, living among humans in disguise. A jinn, he explained, could form attachments to humans, sometimes even unions. But such marriages were not born of love. They were pacts, bindings, bargains made with forces far older than time. And those who entered such unions rarely understood what they had agreed to until it was too late. Emily tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Father Thomas placed a hand gently on hers and said that what she described, the isolation, the house, the symbols, the physical changes, aligned with ancient accounts of spiritual entrapment. She wasn't just married to a man named Adrian. She was bound to something not entirely human, something that fed on her presence, something that had hidden its true nature for a reason. When she asked what she could do, his expression darkened. He said that freeing herself wouldn't be easy. These bonds weren't legal or emotional. They were metaphysical, spiritual. It would take more than prayer. The house itself might be the anchor, or the symbols, or even a ritual she had unknowingly participated in. He urged her to search for anything unusual from the beginning of their relationship. Gifts, vows, spoken words, gestures that felt strange at the time, but were dismissed. Emily left the church with the book in her bag and a cold knot of dread in her stomach. As she walked back through the woods, every sound seemed louder. Every rustling leaf, every cracking branch made her heart race. When she reached the house, she paused before going inside. Something in the air had shifted. The windows looked darker than she remembered, and the door seemed too still, like it was waiting. That night, Emily didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, the priest's book open in her lap, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. The images disturbed her, things that looked like rituals, symbols nearly identical to the ones she'd found in the house, accounts of people whose souls were slowly drained by unseen forces. She read about marriages that weren't truly marriages, but entrapments forged through spells and spoken words designed to bind a human to a jinn. One passage described a woman who thought she'd found the love of her life, only to discover years later that her husband was something that could never age, never die, never truly feel love. It lived through her, fed on her energy, and when she had nothing left to give, it moved on to someone else. Emily didn't want to believe it, but the more she read, the more her memories twisted into a darker truth. She remembered their wedding night, how Adrian had whispered in a language she didn't recognize as he slid the ring onto her finger, how the candles flickered wildly in their bedroom, even though all the windows were shut, how she'd felt dizzy, almost drugged when they first kissed as husband and wife. She had chalked it up to nerves and excitement. But now, through the lens of this ancient book, it felt like something else entirely. A ritual. A binding. She crept out of bed and went to the basement door. It was still locked. She fetched a knife from the kitchen and wedged it between the doorframe and the lock, pushing with all her weight until it finally snapped open. The air that hit her from the other side was damp and cold, smelling of earth, smoke, and something bitterly metallic. The stairs creaked beneath her as she descended into darkness, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb that swung slowly above her head. The room was nothing like she expected. It wasn't a study or an office, it was a shrine. Symbols were carved into the stone walls, painted in black and red. Tall candles burned at the edges of the room, casting dancing shadows that made the space feel alive. In the center was a large circle drawn on the floor, filled with more symbols and bones. Small ones, maybe animal, maybe not. At the far end stood a table covered in strange items, feathers, vials of thick black liquid, dried flowers, a book bound in what looked like skin. She moved closer, her heart hammering in her chest. One of the pages in the open book matched the wedding ceremony Adrian had led her through. The exact words, the same phrases he whispered that night, the ones she had thought were poetic or symbolic. According to this book, those words weren't vows. They were incantations, ancient phrases meant to tie a human soul to something inhuman. She stumbled backward, the floor feeling like it shifted beneath her. Her breath came in short gasps, and the walls felt like they were closing in. That's when she heard footsteps above. Slow, measured. Adrian was awake. She hadn't heard the bedroom door open. He was coming down the stairs. She backed away from the shrine, extinguishing the nearest candle with her hand, her skin blistering from the heat. She needed to hide. There was no time to escape the basement. Her eyes darted to the side, and she slipped behind a tall shelf stacked with jars of powder and bone. She could see the staircase through a crack between the wood. Adrian descended, slowly, each step deliberate. His face was calm, but his eyes, they weren't human anymore. There was a glow in them, faint and unnatural, as if lit from within. He walked into the center of the room and stood in the middle of the circle. He didn't speak. Instead, he raised his arms and began to chant in the same language she'd heard whispering from the walls. The flames of the candles surged upward, as if responding to his voice. Emily clutched the book to her chest, pressing her mouth shut to keep from gasping, her entire body shaking as the room began to hum with a strange, low vibration that passed through her bones. Emily didn't know how long she stayed hidden behind the shelf, frozen in fear, watching Adrian chant within the circle. The low, vibrating hum that filled the basement made her bones feel brittle, like they could splinter with the slightest movement. The flickering candlelight made the shadows dance wildly across the walls, but the shadows moved too deliberately, as if they weren't reacting to the flame at all. They slithered, they stretched, and some even seemed to crawl against gravity, inching upward toward the ceiling like they were alive. Adrian's voice shifted as he chanted, growing deeper, more guttural. It was no longer a man's voice. It was layered now, echoing in ways that didn't match the size of the room. One voice seemed to come from his mouth, another from the corners of the basement, and a third from directly behind her, even though no one stood there. Emily's fingers gripped the edges of the shelf tightly as she fought to keep her breath, silent. The book she clutched throbbed with unnatural warmth against her chest, as though it, too, recognized the words being spoken. Suddenly, Adrian stopped. The silence hit like a slap. The humming ceased. The candles dimmed. Then, slowly, he turned his head, not toward the stairs, but directly at her hiding spot. His eyes met hers through the narrow space between two jars of bone dust. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his face stretched into a smile, one too wide, too calm, too knowing. A moment later, he turned away and walked upstairs without a word. Emily remained frozen for several minutes, unsure if it was a trap, unsure if he was standing just out of sight, waiting. Eventually she stood, her legs trembling so badly she almost collapsed. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were breathing, and she realized the basement wasn't just a place of ritual. It was alive in a way, a sacred chamber meant to house a power far beyond human understanding. She didn't know if the house had created it, or if Adrian had carved it into the earth over time, feeding it piece by piece with intention and malice. She took the book and a handful of items from the table, black candles, a bottle of thick salt, and a rusted key she hadn't noticed before. She didn't know what they were for, but instinct told her they were important. She ascended the stairs in silence, listening for any movement. The house creaked, but no footsteps followed. No voice called her name. When she reached the bedroom, Adrian was gone. The bed was made, the window open. The breeze coming in was cold, yet the air in the room felt unnaturally warm, like it was resisting the outside world. She locked the door and spread the items on the floor, turning back to the book and flipping through the pages feverishly. One chapter described how a human could sever a jinn's connection by reversing the original pact, but it came with warnings. The jinn would resist, it would retaliate, and the person attempting the reversal needed to be absolutely certain of the jinn's true name and the object through which the bond was first sealed. Emily's mind raced. The ring. He had placed it on her finger during the ceremony, whispering those incantations. It had never come off, not even once. Not for a shower, not for sleep. It was warm even in winter. She grabbed a knife and tried to slide the ring off. It wouldn't budge. Her skin had grown around it, almost like it was a part of her. She pressed harder, pain blooming along her finger. But the metal didn't move. The air in the room grew heavier. She could feel something stirring outside the door, a presence pressing against the frame. She needed more knowledge, more tools, more time. She turned to the final pages of the book, where the ink became more erratic, as if written in desperation. There were diagrams, strange formations that resembled the layout of her home. The living room, the kitchen, the basement, and at the center of it all, a shape that didn't belong to the architecture. A chamber beneath the house that hadn't been visible, at least not yet. A place where the final ritual was marked to begin.